In this chapter, we're going to be looking at management theories and some history of management as it's developed over time. We'll also look at the issues and challenges facing managers today. I'll be covering this material in 6 categories or 6 theories of management, as you can see on this screen. The book sets it out a little differently. They go through different perspectives. So they start with the classical perspective, which will have scientific and administrative management in there. Then they move to the behavioral approach or perspective. This in the book is broken out into 2, which is the human relations approach, which was the early movement, and then what we currently refer to as organizational behavior, but I'll refer to it in all testing materials or work as the behavioral approach. Then we move into the quantitative perspective, and in the book they refer to and talk about management science and operations management. I'm going to keep it simple and refer to that as the quantitative approach. And then the last 2, systems and contingency, fall under what they call the integrative approach. So we're going to look at theory and history. Theory is important because it provides us with a framework for organizing what we know and providing a path for us to take action. And these theories are grounded in reality. They're grounded in research studies. Managers do develop their own theories about how they should run their organizations, and by looking at theories that have been researched and proven, it can help us with managing organizations. So why do we look at history? Well, anytime we look at history, we have to learn about how things have developed over time, and it also allows us to avoid any mistakes that may have been made previously by other people. So history and theory are important, and that's why this chapter provides a nice framework for us to move forward with the study of management. So now let's jump into scientific management. Scientific management was concerned with improving the performance of individual workers. So what we were looking to do with this is to increase the efficiency and the productivity of each of our individual workers. This grew out of the Industrial Revolution's labor shortage at the beginning of the 20th century. So Frederick Taylor is he's known as the father of scientific management. What he did in his studies was he replaced rule of thumb methods with scientifically based work methods. So what he did was he studied the work being done and he broke it down into smaller parts so that he could train people on the most efficient way to do the work. By studying each element of a worker's job, he could time it and figure out exactly how long each piece would take. This allowed him to eliminate what he noticed and termed soldiering, which is deliberately working at a pace that is slower than it needs to be to get the work done. He also believed in selecting, training, teaching, and developing workers. So we think of that today when we go to apply for a job. They're looking for someone who is a good fit for a job. But going back to before all of these theories, people were just hired and put into a job because there was an opening. But he believed in picking the right person for the right job and providing them with the training they needed. And by analyzing jobs, he was able to come up with the most efficient way for a job to be done, and he would train them according to that. He also believed in piecework pay system, and he used this to motivate and control workers. So he would decide what he thought was the appropriate amount that should be completed, and you would be paid more if you met or exceeded that goal. Frank and Lillian Gilbreth were other pioneers in scientific management. They were a husband and wife team of industrial engineers, and they made great strides in bricklaying using motion pictures. So they would film workers laying brick, and they were able to break the task down and take it from 18 different movements to 5, which resulted in increased productivity of 200%. You're probably more familiar with their story of their family. They applied all their ideas to raising their 12 children, which became the book and the original Cheaper by the Dozen movie. Now let's shift gears to the next perspective, which is the administrative management perspective. This also falls under the classical approaches. But this one, instead of looking at individuals and increasing their productivity, we're focused now on the entire organization, the total organization. Okay. Two people of note here are Henry Fayol and Max Weber. So Henry Fayol systematized the practice of management. He came up with the 14 principles of management. So I have them here. I don't expect you to memorize these, but I think it's a good reference point so you can get an idea of the importance of this. Fayol's work allowed for management to be taught. He was able to share his knowledge and experience with other managers, and it became something that could actually be taught in schools. So what we see here, and you can look through some of these. At the top, we have specialization of labor. This is similar to what Frederick Taylor was looking at in terms of hiring people for certain jobs and then having training to improve their skills and to develop them. Authority, having power in your position over your subordinates, the right to give them direction. Let's see, subordination of individual interests. When you're at work, you should only be doing work things. Remuneration, being paid fair for your work. A line of authority. We'll see this as we get into the organizing function of management, but line of authority means there's a formal chain of command running from the top to the bottom of the organization, and he likened it to how the military is set up. So these are the 14 principles of management that Fayol came up with. The other thing he's known for is he was the first to identify the specific management functions of planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. Now, moving on to Max Weber, his theory was that of bureaucracy, which if you ask your parents or your grandparents about bureaucracy, they'll probably have a negative connotation of that and think of how things are tied up in red tape in, say, the government. But bureaucracy was based on a rational set of guidelines for structuring an organization. Let's look at the main points of his bureaucracy, his theory. He believed in division of labor. So this also aligns with what Henry Fayol was talking about. Jobs should be broken down into simple, routine, and well-defined tasks. You should know what your job is, right? That makes it a lot easier. There's an authority hierarchy. That's similar to the line of authority. There should be a formal selection. People are selected for their jobs based on their qualifications. There should be formal rules and regulations, like standard operating procedures. So in the workplace, we have, maybe a dress code or a dress policy. We have vacation policies. We have sick policies. It applies to everyone. So under this bureaucracy and under his principles of management, these are things that are applied to everyone in an organization. And lastly, even though this sounds negative, impersonality. So this means there's no favoritism, right? It's a uniform application of the rules and controls, so all the policies. It's not according to who we like better than someone else. So now we're going to shift to behavioral management. So as I mentioned, the book breaks it down into two types here. We have the human relations movement, which was the early movement. It was very simplistic. So the theories that fall under this that we'll see in our motivation chapter at the end of the semester are Maslow's hierarchy of needs, McGregor's theory X and Y. They were very simplistic. What grew out of this was organizational behavior, and this is what it is referred to. You will probably take, if you continue in management, you'll take a course that's called organizational behavior, which will just focus on this aspect in management. This is the current movement. It is much broader, and it looks at individual and group behavior in the workplace. And the goal with organizational behavior is to explain, predict, and influence behavior. Okay, and we'll cover that more later in the course. So how did we get to this behavioral approach? Well, I'm going to talk to you about the Hawthorne studies. The Hawthorne studies were conducted at a Western Electric plant between 1927 and 1935. Now, the importance of the time frame is that this is when Frederick Taylor and the research in scientific theory was really taking off. Productivity gains were being found in all kinds of ways, with individual workers, and there were continuing studies trying to find the optimal way to do everything. So this study was about workplace lighting. So this illumination study had a control group and an experimental group. This was a scientific experiment. And they were changing the lighting level to see which would be the best, which would produce the most, which would be the most productive for the workers in the facility. But what's interesting about this study is that nothing they expected to happen actually happened. And they were only able to figure out why through this interview program they had at the end, which confirmed that it was the people that were important and the people that made the difference in this study. So as they reduced or changed the lighting, they saw productivity gains. And it was funny because they saw productivity gains for the control group as well as the experimental group. It made no sense. And productivity really only dropped off when they couldn't physically see well anymore. It got to be so dim in the room, their work was affected. And as it turned out, it was because productivity went up because the workers were so amazed and happy to be paid attention to. This was the first time their work had been appreciated and studied and looked at, and that's what caused the productivity gains. So this is that whole entry into valuing the human element at work. As part of this study, they also used a piecework incentive plan on the production workers. Now, we saw this with scientific theory. If you make more and you're more productive, you'll make more money. That's the idea of a piecework pay plan. But it didn't work the way they expected. Again, workers had actually established informal levels of what they thought were acceptable output. And they actually termed people that overproduced to make more money the rate busters, and those that couldn't produce or didn't produce the acceptable level as the chiselers, not really pulling their weight. And again, it was that the group was a very cohesive group. They got along well, and they talked to each other, and they talked about what was acceptable, and that had an influence on their productivity. It wasn't all about just getting paid more. Prior to this, workers were really just thought of as being interchangeable, cogs in a machine, but the Hawthorne studies and this movement into this behavioral approach valued the individuals and the groups working in organizations, leading to what we now call organizational behavior. Now let's touch on quantitative management. Under this section, the book breaks it down to management science and operations management, but I will refer to this area just as the quantitative management approach. The focus here is on decision making, economic effectiveness, mathematical models are used here, and also computers to solve quantitative problems. This was developed or started to emerge during World War II as the people working through the war to efficiently and effectively move resources around and deploy them came out of the war and re-entered regular society. They brought with them the tools and techniques they were using during the war. Quantitative management, we're applying mathematical analysis to problems, and we apply these mathematical models and process to management situations. We can use simulations or mathematical modeling under this to make effective decisions. For instance, a business could use modeling to figure out how many people they need to have working in a store, say how many tellers do we need at a bank during certain days or during certain busy times, or how many cashiers do we need at ShopRite, on a Monday, or a Monday when it's snowing, or any of those kinds of things. So using data and using mathematical modeling, simulations, or computers to solve quantitative problems. So far, we've covered the classical behavior and quantitative approaches to management, but it's important to note that these are not necessarily contradictory or mutually exclusive. Even though each of the three perspectives makes very different assumptions and predictions, each can also complement the other. A complete understanding of management requires an appreciation of all these perspectives. Systems theory recognizes that we have internal interdependencies and that there is environmental influence. So with a system, we have an interrelated set of elements functioning as a whole. So within a system, we can have subsystems. We can also distinguish between an open system and a closed system. So an open system is one that interacts with its external environment. A closed system does not. By viewing an organization as a system, we can identify four basic elements, which are inputs, transformation processes, outputs, and feedback. So let's look at an example, and we'll use RVCC as an example of an open system because it does interact with its external environment. First, we start with inputs, which are the resources we discussed in Chapter 1. Human, financial, physical, and informational resources. So at RVCC, we have financial resources in the form of tuition revenue coming in from students and aid coming in from the county as well as the state and the federal government. Our human resources are the people working at the college. That includes the president, the professors, the people working in financial aid, finance, admissions, registration, and the custodial staff. So everyone here is an input into our system. We have informational inputs as well, such as what are the requirements for issuing degrees in the state of New Jersey. Then through technological and managerial processes, we take the inputs and transform them into outputs. So some of these control systems or administrative systems involve making sure you're taking the right classes in order to earn the degree you want to get, making sure your grade point average is allowing you to progress through towards your degree. Our outputs, for the most part, are going to be issuing degrees to students. Once we have outputs into the environment, we get feedback from the environment that should inform any changes we need to make. So if we are not adequately preparing students for their four-year schools through getting their associates here, then we need to change something. Or if they're training for a profession and they're not adequately trained to do that work, we need to make a change to what we're doing here. Now, we have different subsystems at the college. For instance, we have different academic departments, right? They do run kind of autonomously. Each department has their own department chair, but it's important for managers to recognize how their decisions affect and are affected by other subsystems within the organization. So, for instance, if one academic department were to change the requirements for taking a certain course, it could have a negative impact on students taking courses in another academic department. So it's important that communication between these subsystems is adequate. So let's look at a couple more terms related to systems perspective. We have synergy and entropy. Synergy is when our subsystems are more successful working together than they would be working alone. So that this whole system together, the college in our example, is more productive and efficient than the sum of its parts. So an example in the book talks about how Disney is so good at synergy. So Disney is made up of a lot of different companies, or smaller subsystems, we'll say. You have the movies, you have the theme parks, you have the stores, And they also have the parent company also has like ABC News and other companies. And they work better together than they would if they were all separate businesses working alone. That's what we talk about with synergy. And Disney is so good at this because of the way they cross-promote one product or area with another. Lastly, we have the contingency perspective. This perspective recognizes the situational nature of management. When we looked at scientific, administrative, behavioral, and the quantitative approaches to management, these are considered universal perspectives because they try to identify the one best way to do something. And what we see with the contingency perspective is that that doesn't always work. It suggests that each organization is unique and that the appropriate managerial behavior for managing an organization depends or is contingent upon the current situation in that organization. And we can see this clearly through going back to what we discussed between scientific management and the start of the behavioral management approach, right? So Frederick Taylor found the one best way to do some task, but when those kinds of things are applied to a different setting, for instance, the piece rate system, right? He determined if you pay people per item, they will produce more because they want to get paid more. Well, that didn't apply at the Western Electric plant. They weren't producing as much as they possibly could produce because they had a group dynamic in place. And they came up with what they thought was an appropriate amount to produce. So different managerial styles can come into play here, making something work better than something else. So with this perspective, it just recognizes that it really does depend on the organization, the people, and the situation, what's going to work best. You can find this image in the book, but I like to point out because I think it's important to understand the progression of the different theories and the time frame, because anything that's happening in terms of legislation or what's changing in our world is dependent on what's going on in our world at that given time. So we see the classical perspective, which remember is the scientific theory and administrative theory. Those were turn of the century, 1900s, late 1800s. That's the Industrial Revolution. We had a shortage of labor. We needed to become more productive. That's when these studies trying to find ways to increase the productivity and efficiency of the individual workers was very important. And it lasted for quite a while. Then we saw the behavioral perspective come into play in the late 20s, early 30s, and that was the Western Electric experiments, the Hawthorne studies. And that made us realize how important the people working in our organizations were. Then we move into the 40s, and this is World War II, and we start seeing things that are being used in the war effort actually being able to be used in civilian life, in businesses. In the 50s, we see the systems perspective come in the 60s, the contingencies perspective, and then we have these newer contemporary perspectives. And we have some authors listed here, and you will get familiar with some of these names. We will see theories later in the course from Michael Porter. You might remember that name from Intro to Business. And Malcolm Gladwell he's also got, if you want to read some really interesting books, he's got some great books out there too. As we wrap up this chapter, I just want to take a moment to point out some of the contemporary management issues and challenges. These are the things that managers should expect to have to deal with as they run departments, run businesses, and, having strong conceptual skills, being able to see the big picture, being able to see how the economy is going to affect your business, how things happening in the world are affecting your business is very important. Because remember, if we don't pay attention to our environments and adapt as necessary, we will see our organization go into decline. Remember the term, entropy, and people have to be able to adapt. So you can look at this list and read up on it in the book, but I just wanted to introduce you to some of these concepts.